When I moved into my new home, I couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. The house, modest as it was, felt like a reflection of all my hard work. A cozy little 2-bedroom cottage with a front porch perfect for evening relaxation and a garden where I could finally grow all the plants I had always wanted. One of the first things I did was plant tomatoes in my front yard. I had always dreamed of growing my own food, and the idea of fresh, ripe tomatoes from my own garden seemed like the perfect start. I carefully chose a spot on the edge of the yard where the plants would get enough sunlight and set about planting them with the enthusiasm only a new homeowner could have. My small patch of tomatoes became my little sanctuary, a spot where I could unwind after a long day of work, tending to my plants and watching them grow. As I sat in my front yard, sipping iced tea on warm afternoons, I began to notice the neighborhood around me. It was quiet, pristine, and picturesque, exactly the kind of place I had always imagined living in. The houses were all impeccably maintained, each one looking like it had stepped out of a home improvement catalog. Lawns were perfectly manicured, hedges trimmed to perfection, and flower beds laid out with geometrical precision. But as I soon learned, this pristine image wasn't just an aesthetic choice. It was the result of a very strict set of rules. The Homeowners Association, or HOA, was in charge of keeping the neighborhood looking uniform. At first, I had no problem with the idea. After all, who doesn't want a well-kept neighborhood? But it wasn't long before I realized that the HOA wasn't just about maintaining appearances. It was about control. The first indication that something was off came when I received a letter a few days after moving in. It was a formal notice from the HOA. I opened it eagerly, expecting something routine, maybe a welcome letter or some tips on local services. But what I found was something far more unsettling: a complaint. According to the letter, I had violated the HOA's guidelines by planting edible plants in my front yard, specifically my tomatoes. The HOA's rulebook, which I had yet to even see, apparently stated that edible plants were not permitted in the front yard. Everything had to be confined to the backyard, where it couldn't be seen by anyone. I was confused. Surely this couldn't be right. Tomatoes aren't exactly an eyesore, and they certainly weren't hurting anyone. But I knew better than to ignore an HOA letter. They had the power to fine you, and I didn't want to risk any trouble so soon after moving in. I carefully dug up the plants and relocated them to a corner of the backyard, though it did irk me that something so innocent had been treated like a crime. The very next day, as I was finishing up a little more yard work, I saw her, Karen. She was standing at the end of my driveway, clipboard in hand, glaring at my backyard with a sense of scrutiny that bordered on absurd. She wore a smile that was far too bright, too polite, almost as though she was trying to convince herself and everyone else that this was just a casual chat. She was the kind of person who could turn a pleasant conversation into an interrogation if she wanted to. "Hello, I'm Karen from the HOA," she said, her voice almost too cheerful. "I just wanted to check on your garden after your recent adjustments." I stared at her, trying to figure out if she was being friendly or if she was about to issue another complaint. She didn't waste time getting to the point. "Just a heads up," she continued, "we really prefer that all plants in the front yard be decorative only. No edible plants. But I see you've moved them to the back now. Good move, good move." I nodded, unsure how to respond. I wasn't sure if she was actually complimenting me or just waiting for me to say something that she could hold against me. "We like to maintain a very specific aesthetic," she said, her tone suddenly becoming more authoritative. "Everything needs to be uniform to keep the neighborhood looking its best." It wasn't a suggestion. It was an order. Before I could ask more questions or protest, she was already turning away, clipboard in hand. She didn't need to explain why she had such a rule or why edible plants were seen as a violation. She didn't even ask me if I was okay with the decision. It was clear Karen and the HOA were in charge, and I was just a homeowner in their way. That was my first real interaction with Karen. I had no idea it would be the start of a long battle, one that would stretch far beyond tomato plants and front yard aesthetics. At that moment, I still believed the HOA had good intentions. I thought they were just doing their job, trying to keep the neighborhood beautiful. But little did I know, this was only the beginning of my nightmare with the HOA Karen, and things were about to get a lot worse. A week passed after my first interaction with Karen, and I thought maybe, just maybe, she would forget about the tomatoes. I had done what she asked. My plants were safely in the backyard now, and everything seemed fine. But then the second letter arrived. This time, it wasn't a casual reminder. It was a formal warning with an official fine attached. The letter was crisp, typed in an aggressive font that practically screamed serious business. The heading read, "Notice of violation, non-compliance with HOA rules." My heart sank as I read through the contents, which outlined another issue with my property. Apparently, my lawn had not been mowed to the correct length. The fine was $75. I stared at the letter in disbelief. My lawn wasn't unkempt. It wasn't even long. It was green, neat, and freshly mowed. Sure, there were a couple of blades that were maybe a bit taller than the others, but it wasn't a jungle. I couldn't fathom how anyone could look at it and think it was a violation. I'd been so careful about every detail. I had even made sure to trim the edges along the sidewalk with precision. But Karen had found something to complain about again. And this time, it wasn't even about my tomatoes. It was about grass. I tried to shake it off, but frustration started to bubble up. So I did what anyone would do when they receive a ridiculous fine. I called Karen. The phone rang twice before she picked up. Her voice was smooth and practiced, as if she were waiting for this moment. "Hello, this is Karen from the HOA. How may I help you?" "Hi, Karen. This is your name from your address. I received a letter about a fine for my lawn, and I just wanted to clarify what's going on. It's not that I'm ignoring the rules, but I'm having trouble understanding what I've done wrong." I could hear the slightest pause on the other end of the line. I knew Karen wasn't one for open conversations, so when she responded, it was with the tone of someone who had already made up their mind. "Your lawn doesn't meet the specific height requirement stated in our guidelines," she said. "It's not uniform enough. The HOA standards are very clear about maintaining consistency throughout the neighborhood." I felt a rush of heat to my face. "Karen, my lawn is perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with it. No one else's lawn looks the same. Why is mine being singled out?" There was an audible sigh on the other end. It wasn't one of frustration, but one of impatience, as though she was humoring me. Section 2, subsection C of the HOA bylaws clearly states that lawns must be kept at exactly 3 inches in height. Yours is slightly above that. It's a uniformity issue. We can't have properties looking untidy. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I looked down at the grass outside my window. There was no way it was overgrown. It was well within reason, and certainly nowhere near untidy. But it didn't matter. Karen wasn't hearing it. I tried to explain again, but her response was always the same. Rules are rules. I was done. I was about to say something I might regret when she cut me off, almost as if she had anticipated my frustration. "Of course you have the option to fix it. If you can't meet the guidelines, we'll proceed with the fine and any further action as deemed necessary." And just like that, the conversation ended. I was left with nothing but a fine and the gnawing feeling that I had no power here. It was clear that this wasn't a one-time slip-up. Karen wasn't just enforcing rules. She was actively looking for ways to push her agenda. The more I tried to comply, the more unreasonable the rules became. I hung up the phone and stood there in stunned silence. This wasn't just about a lawn anymore. It was about control. The following days were filled with tense uncertainty. I couldn't believe I had to fight over something as trivial as grass height. But soon, the situation became even clearer. It wasn't just me. A few of my neighbors started to talk to me about similar experiences with Karen and the HOA. They had received warnings about their gardens, their lawns, their fences, each one more ridiculous than the last. My next-door neighbor, Tom, came over one evening with a copy of his latest HOA letter. He had received a fine for leaving his garbage can out for an extra hour after pickup. He couldn't believe it either. Like me, he had always done everything by the book. But now it seemed like the HOA had their eyes on every little detail of his life. Tom leaned in closer. It's not just you, man. They're doing this to everyone. We're all getting hit with fines. They're just making it up as they go. It was the first time I realized just how far-reaching Karen's grip was. She wasn't just nitpicking my yard. She was spreading her control over every little aspect of the neighborhood. And worse, she was doing it with the full support of the HOA. The more I talked to others, the more I saw a pattern. People were being fined for things that didn't make sense, things that no one should care about in a neighborhood that was otherwise perfectly fine. But there was one thing that began to stand out. No one was willing to fight back. Everyone just grumbled about it, paid the fines, and let Karen get away with it. But not me. I wasn't just going to stand there and let her destroy my peace. The seed of rebellion was planted, and it was about to grow. The first conflict had arrived, and it wasn't just about tomatoes or grass anymore. It was about power, control, and taking back what was rightfully mine. As the weeks went by, it became clear that Karen wasn't going to let up. I thought that maybe if I just kept my head down, followed her ridiculous rules, and paid the fines, she'd eventually lose interest and move on to someone else. But that wasn't how things worked in Karen's world. It didn't take long before the next issue arose. My fence. It was a modest wooden fence, nothing fancy, just something to give my backyard a little privacy. I hadn't even thought twice about it when I moved in, but one afternoon, as I was mowing my lawn, properly this time, to avoid any more fines, I noticed Karen walking up to my property line, clipboard in hand, eyes scanning everything like a hawk. I braced myself. It was inevitable. "Hello," she called out, her voice as syrupy sweet as ever. "I just wanted to check on your fence. It's, a little taller than the approved height for fences in the neighborhood." I stood there, wiping sweat from my brow, trying to process what she had just said. My fence was about 5 feet tall, maybe a little taller in spots where the ground sloped, but it wasn't a towering eyesore. It was a simple privacy fence, just like a dozen others in the neighborhood. Karen continued, not waiting for me to speak. "The guidelines state that fences cannot exceed 4 feet in height, and yours is well over that. I'm going to have to issue a fine." I stared at her, the frustration boiling inside me. "Karen, that's ridiculous. There are fences in this neighborhood that are taller than mine. Why am I being singled out?" Her eyes narrowed slightly, but she didn't back down. "Uniformity. Your name. The community needs to maintain uniformity. That's the whole point of the HOA." "Uniformity? You mean control?" I shot back, my voice shaking with anger. "I'm just trying to have a little privacy in my own backyard, and now you want to fine me for something that's literally the same as what everyone else has. This is insane." Karen didn't flinch. "I'll be sending you the official notice of violation. You'll have a chance to appeal it, of course, but I strongly advise you to comply. We don't want to escalate this further." Before I could say anything else, she turned and walked away, as though she had just delivered a perfectly reasonable request. But I was seeing red. This wasn't about rules anymore. It was about her power trip. She wanted to micromanage every aspect of my life, and I couldn't take it anymore. A few days later, the official notice came in the mail. It was the same form letter I'd gotten before, outlining my violation of the HOA rules and the accompanying fine. This time, it was $100 for the fence infraction. My blood boiled as I read the letter. There were no exceptions, no flexibility, just more rules to stifle me. But this time, something in me snapped. I wasn't going to just roll over. If Karen wanted a fight, she was going to get one. I started doing some research. I pulled up the HOA bylaws online and read through every section. I reached out to a few neighbors and began asking questions, trying to figure out if anyone else had experienced the same thing. To my surprise, a lot of people had. Tom was dealing with fines for his garage door. Another neighbor had been fined for leaving their garden tools in the backyard too long, and one neighbor had even gotten a warning for painting their front door a shade of blue that didn't match the HOA's approved color palette. The more I dug, the more I realized just how arbitrary and unfair the HOA's rules were. I wasn't the only one being harassed. This was happening to everyone. And I knew that if I didn't take a stand now, things were only going to get worse. Karen had set a dangerous precedent, and she was emboldened by the fact that no one had pushed back before. I called Tom that evening, and we started planning. He had already gotten a lawyer involved to contest some of his fines, and he suggested I do the same. I wasn't sure about the legal route at first, but the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. We could file a lawsuit. We could take this to court. The HOA had been abusing its power for too long, and it was time someone held them accountable. But it wasn't just about the fines anymore. It was about all of us. The more people I talked to, the more I realized that the HOA wasn't just targeting me or Tom. They were punishing the entire community. We all lived under the constant threat of fines for the most trivial things, and no one had ever questioned it. But that was about to change. We weren't going to be silent anymore. By the time the weekend came, I had gathered a small group of neighbors who were fed up, just like me. We met in my backyard, in the shadow of Karen's all-seeing eyes, and shared our stories. There was power in numbers. If we could all band together, we could put up a fight. The idea of taking on the HOA didn't seem so impossible anymore. I wasn't just fighting for my tomatoes or my fence. I was fighting for the freedom to live without the constant pressure of Karen's control. And this time, I wasn't backing down. The tension in the neighborhood reached a boiling point over the next few weeks. After our meeting, a few of my neighbors, Tom included, decided to join forces, challenging the HOA's increasingly absurd rules. We filed complaints, sent emails, and even began to compile a list of violations that seemed completely arbitrary. But no matter what we did, Karen and the HOA seemed to be one step ahead, always finding new ways to punish us. But then came the final straw, the thing that made it clear this wasn't just about enforcing rules. It was about power, control, and intimidation. It happened late one Friday night. I had just gotten home from work and was getting ready to relax when I received an unexpected knock at the door. I opened it, only to find two large men standing on my doorstep. They wore dark suits and looked as if they'd just come from some corporate boardroom. Behind them, there was a tow truck. "Are you your name?" one of the men asked, his voice gruff and professional. "Yes," I replied, bewildered, wondering what was going on. I was half expecting to be asked to move my car, but there was something off about the whole situation. "You are in violation of HOA rules," the man continued, holding up a clipboard, "and we've been instructed to tow your vehicle. Immediate action is required." My heart sank. "Tow my vehicle?" I repeated, completely stunned. "For what?" The second man spoke up. "Your car is in violation of the HOA's parking guidelines. You've parked it too close to the edge of your driveway, blocking part of the sidewalk. You've received several warnings about this, but you failed to comply. Now we have no choice but to take it." I blinked at them, trying to process the situation. I had parked my car the same way I had for months. The driveway was big enough, and there were no issues with the placement of my vehicle. The idea that it could violate a guideline seemed laughable, but there they were, ready to haul my car away like some criminal. "No," I said firmly, "you're not taking my car." The man holding the clipboard didn't flinch. "We have a contract with the HOA. You've had ample time to fix this issue, and you've ignored the warnings. We're within our rights." I glanced past them to see Karen standing across the street, watching the whole thing unfold. She had a smug smile on her face, her arms crossed, as if she was enjoying every moment of this. She'd orchestrated the whole thing. The thought hit me like a ton of bricks. This wasn't just about enforcing rules. It was about breaking me down. Karen knew how far she could push, and she was testing me now. I felt the heat of anger rising in my chest. This was beyond a petty fine. This was an attack on my ability to live freely in my own home. I wasn't going to let her win. "I'll call the cops if you try to tow my car," I said, my voice trembling with a mix of fear and defiance. "This is completely unreasonable." The first man shrugged. "It's your call, but we have the authority of the HOA. You'll be liable for all costs if you don't comply. I didn't back down, but the reality of the situation hit me hard. I could fight this, but at what cost? The thought of dealing with a lawsuit, towing fees, and more fines made my stomach churn. It wasn't just about the car. It was about the HOA breaking me, forcing me to submit to their rule. They were pushing me to the edge. With a deep breath, I made a decision. I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of watching me lose, but I also wasn't going to let them ruin my life. I stepped back into my house, grabbed my phone, and dialed Tom. "Get over here now," I whispered urgently. "We need help." Meanwhile, I was looking for ways to get the word out, even if it meant risking my own position in the community. I created a private Facebook group for the homeowners who had been targeted by the HOA. The group quickly grew as neighbors shared their own horror stories, from fines for having unapproved garden gnomes to being told to remove perfectly healthy trees because they weren't on the HOA's approved planting list. People were angry, and I was more than ready to harness that anger. I spent late nights researching the laws governing HOAs in our state. It became clear that many of Karen's actions were either illegal or at least ethically questionable. I even reached out to a local journalist who had written about HOA corruption in the past. The journalist, Claire, was interested, but she needed evidence, proof that Karen's HOA wasn't just enforcing rules, but actively abusing its power. The legal filings, the complaints, and the audit request would be our first step in gathering that evidence. But just when things started to seem like we had a real chance of winning, Karen made her next move. It came in the form of a letter that arrived in my mailbox one morning. Notice of intent to foreclose. The letter was from the HOA, and it stated that they had initiated the process to foreclose on my property for continuous non-compliance with HOA rules. It felt like a punch in the gut. I had always paid my dues on time, followed the rules, and tried to keep my property in good condition. Yet here they were, threatening to take my home over things as petty as a tomato plant and a fence that was a few inches too tall. The notice made me feel small, powerless. But then something clicked. They were going too far, and this was their final desperate move. It was the HOA showing its true colors. If they couldn't control us through petty fines and intimidation, they would try to destroy us by making us fear losing everything. But instead of caving, I got angrier. I wasn't just going to sit back and let Karen push me out of my own home. I grabbed my phone and called Linda immediately. "They've gone too far," I said, my voice shaking with adrenaline. "We need to go public with this, now." In that moment, I realized that this wasn't just about fighting back against an unreasonable HOA. It was about something bigger, about standing up for what was right, for the right to live without fear of arbitrary fines or the whim of a single person. We were about to escalate this fight to a level the HOA never saw coming. It was game time. The letter from the HOA, threatening foreclosure, was the wake-up call I needed. Karen had pushed me, and the entire neighborhood, too far. The gloves were off. There was no more backing down. The community was finally united, and we were all ready to fight. The first thing I did was contact Linda, our lawyer, and let her know about the foreclosure threat. She wasn't surprised. In fact, she seemed almost relieved. "This is exactly what we've been waiting for," she said, her tone firm. "They've overstepped again, and it's time to put the pressure on." Linda advised that we file for an injunction, which would temporarily halt any further actions by the HOA while we investigated their practices and built our case. It wasn't a guaranteed win, but it would buy us some time, and it would send a message. The HOA could no longer intimidate us. Meanwhile, I organized a meeting with all the neighbors who had been affected by Karen's reign of terror. Tom, Carla, Greg, and a few others gathered at my house, eager to take action. They were fired up, ready to push back after months of being silenced and threatened. Tom spoke first. "This is it. We're going to make sure they regret ever messing with us. No more hiding, no more complying. It's time for a revolt." I nodded, trying to keep my own nerves under control. "I've been working with Linda. We're filing an injunction. We need everyone's support on this, and we need to go public. We'll make sure people know exactly what Karen and the HOA are doing." Carla, one of the more vocal neighbors, leaned forward. "How are we going to make this public? We've all tried talking to the HOA, and they just ignore us. I say we go to the news." I've been thinking the same thing. There was power in numbers, and the media could shine a spotlight on the HOA's shady practices. We needed to expose Karen's corruption, not just for us, but for anyone else who had been suffering under the same oppressive rules. With our plan in place, we got to work. Linda filed the injunction, and we made sure to collect every piece of evidence we could find, from the arbitrary fines to the way Karen had personally harassed certain neighbors. At the same time, we gathered statements from everyone involved, creating a united front. Our attorney sent a demand letter to the HOA, notifying them that we were prepared to take legal action if they didn't immediately cease and desist from any further foreclosures or fines. But the real kicker came when we went public. I reached out to Claire, the local journalist who had shown interest before. She was on board immediately. In no time, the story was all over the local news. Homeowners fight back against overbearing HOA and corrupt board. The article detailed the excessive fines, the arbitrary rule enforcement, and the HOA's attempt to foreclose on homeowners for minor infractions. Claire had even uncovered a few records that showed how some board members had been skimming money from HOA funds, money that was supposed to be used for community improvements. The news spread like wildfire, and within days, social media was ablaze with complaints about Karen's HOA. People from surrounding neighborhoods started reaching out to share their own stories. And then it happened, the first crack in Karen's armor. At the next HOA meeting, which was packed with residents who had finally gotten the nerve to speak out, the atmosphere was tense. Karen took her usual position at the front of the room, trying to maintain control, but the room was electric with frustration. People weren't backing down anymore. A neighbor named Greg stood up first, his voice loud and clear. "Karen, we've had enough. The fines, the rules, the harassment, it needs to stop, and we're not going to take it anymore." There was an immediate murmur of agreement from the crowd. People who had been too afraid to speak out before were now emboldened by the news coverage and the support they had from the rest of the community. Karen's face reddened, and she tried to take control of the meeting, but it was too late. She was losing her grip. Neighbors started demanding answers about the financial mismanagement and the personal vendettas that had led to these oppressive rules. Someone even asked about the questionable use of HOA funds, referring to the articles Claire had published. Karen's defensive posture wavered, and I could see her starting to panic. The support she had once held from the other board members was beginning to unravel. The more people spoke up, the more isolated she became. It was clear that the days of her unchecked rule were numbered. Linda, who had been present for the meeting, stood up at the right moment, holding a folder full of our documentation. "The HOA is being investigated for financial mismanagement and overreach," she said, her voice authoritative. "If this continues, we will take legal action, and I'm confident that we'll win. This is not just about a fence or a car. It's about fairness, transparency, and justice." The meeting ended in chaos. Several members of the board, who had been quietly supporting Karen, began to whisper amongst themselves. There were murmurs of resignation, and a few even slipped out early, realizing their position was untenable. It was clear that the board was fracturing, and Karen was no longer the untouchable leader she once was. That night, I couldn't help but feel a surge of triumph. We had taken the first major step toward ending Karen's reign, but I knew this battle wasn't over. There would be more twists, more drama, and plenty of hurdles to clear before we could fully reclaim our homes. But at least now, Karen and the HOA were on notice. The fight was far from over, but the tide was turning, and we weren't going to stop until we won. The months that followed the public revelation of the HOA's corrupt practices felt like an emotional roller coaster. Each victory, no matter how small, was followed by a new battle. But one thing was clear: we were gaining momentum, and Karen's reign was beginning to crumble. The injunction had bought us time, and the media coverage had turned the HOA's actions into a public spectacle. People in the community were now watching, and Karen's every move was scrutinized. The pressure was building, and it was only a matter of time before the HOA would either have to fold or face the consequences of its actions. The final showdown came when the HOA scheduled another mandatory meeting to address the complaints and concerns raised by the community. Karen had clearly underestimated how much support we had gathered. She was still confident that she could manage the situation. After all, she'd been the one in control for so long. But this time she was wrong. The meeting was set to take place in the community center, a small, uninspiring building at the heart of the neighborhood. I arrived early, eager to see what the board would do in the face of mounting pressure. By the time the meeting started, the room was packed. Every seat was taken, and there were people standing in the back. It was clear that Karen had lost her grip on the community. No one was afraid to speak their mind anymore. Tom, Carla, Greg, and I sat near the front, but we weren't alone. Several other neighbors who had been hit by unfair fines or targeted by Karen's personal vendettas were present as well, eager to make their voices heard. Linda, our lawyer, sat with us, ready to offer legal support if necessary. The meeting began with Karen trying to assert control, as she always did. She stood at the front of the room, going through the usual scripted complaints about homeowners not following the rules. Her voice was stiff, almost robotic. It was clear she had been rehearsing her talking points, but there was a sense of desperation in her eyes. She knew the walls were closing in. As soon as Karen finished her speech, the room erupted in frustration. The first to speak was Greg, his voice cutting through the tension. Karen, we've had enough. You've used the HOA as your personal playground. You've targeted us, bullied us, and done everything in your power to crush anyone who dared to challenge you. The crowd cheered in agreement. The energy in the room shifted. It was no longer a group of intimidated homeowners. It was a united front ready to take action. Karen's face reddened. She tried to interrupt, but Greg wasn't finished. You're using our hard-earned money to fund your personal vendettas. You find us for things that don't even make sense, like my garden gnomes or the color of my mailbox. You've put the community under constant stress with your ridiculous rules. And now you're trying to foreclose on people's homes for violations that don't exist. Enough is enough. There was a ripple of applause, and a few more people stood up to voice their frustrations. One by one, homeowners shared their stories of how Karen's HOA had hurt them. The accusations kept piling on: wrongful fines, shady financial dealings, and personal grievances masked as community guidelines. The once quiet and compliant residents were now emboldened, speaking with a confidence I hadn't seen before. But it wasn't just the residents in the room who were speaking up. Linda had been working behind the scenes, preparing her legal arguments. She stood up, her voice steady and strong. We've gathered enough evidence to show that this HOA has been operating illegally, both in terms of financial mismanagement and in violation of homeowners' rights. We've filed formal complaints with the state. We have legal grounds to dismantle this board. The air in the room felt electric. The other members of the HOA board, who had been sitting quietly in the background, were now looking uneasy. It was clear they hadn't expected such a coordinated effort from the homeowners. Some of them exchanged nervous glances, while others tried to brush off the accusations. But the damage had been done. And then, just when it seemed like the HOA board was going to try to salvage the situation with more denial, an unexpected twist occurred. One of the other board members, Dave, who had been quiet throughout most of the meeting, stood up. His face was pale, and his hands shook as he spoke. I can't do this anymore, Dave said, his voice barely audible. I've been a part of this for too long, and I've seen things I shouldn't have ignored. I've seen Karen manipulate the rules for her own gain, and I've stayed silent. But I can't stay silent anymore. The room went dead silent. Everyone turned to look at Dave, who was now stepping away from the front of the room. His admission of guilt was like a bombshell, detonating the remaining trust in Karen and the board's ability to lead. Karen's face twisted in anger, but it was clear that the tide had turned. Dave wasn't the only one who had been complicit. Others on the board knew they couldn't continue to defend her, not with the growing public scrutiny and the legal challenges that were mounting. One by one, the other board members began to quietly step down, disavowing their connection to Karen's leadership. And then it happened, the final blow. As the meeting came to a close, one of the homeowners who had been most vocal about Karen's abuses turned to the group and said, "It's time to remove this board. Let's call for a vote right now." The room erupted into applause, and before Karen could protest, the motion to remove the board was put to a vote. The results were overwhelming. Karen and the remaining members of the board were ousted. The power was back in the hands of the homeowners. As Karen tried to leave in a huff, she shot me a venomous look, but I didn't flinch. I knew this was just the beginning. The community had finally reclaimed control of their own homes. We had won. The HOA was dismantled, and the new board would be made up of residents who actually cared about the community, not personal power. As for Karen, well, she had lost everything she had worked so hard to control. I knew she wouldn't go down quietly, but that was her problem now. We'd taken back our lives, and it felt damn good. The dust settled slowly in the aftermath of the dramatic meeting. It was hard to believe what had just happened. Karen and her allies were out, the old board was gone, and for the first time in years, the HOA was no longer a tool of oppression. It felt surreal, almost as if the weight that had been bearing down on us had been lifted overnight. But we all knew this victory didn't just happen. It was the result of months of fighting, organizing, and exposing the truth. The new board was elected swiftly, with many of the neighbors I had stood shoulder to shoulder with now stepping into leadership positions. Tom, Carla, and Greg were among the first to join, and I was nominated as well. It wasn't about seeking power. It was about ensuring that no one would ever be subjected to the same horrors that Karen had inflicted on us. The OOA's new direction was focused on fairness, transparency, and collaboration with the community, not petty rules or personal vendettas. As for Karen, her life after the removal was nothing short of a nightmare. It became clear that her manipulation of the HOA had extended beyond just the neighbors. She had used her position to control everything from landscaping contracts to vendor deals. The stories from disgruntled workers and contractors who had been mistreated or pressured to give her kickbacks surfaced quickly. Even some of the former board members, now safely removed from her influence, were more than willing to come forward with their accounts. Karen's ability to manipulate her position was exposed in full. The most satisfying part of this entire process, however, came when Claire, the local journalist who had covered our story, published her final exposé. Karen's HOA reign of terror, how one woman nearly destroyed a neighborhood, was picked up by larger news outlets and the story spread. It wasn't just a neighborhood scandal anymore. It was a cautionary tale for every HOA in the region, even nationwide. People started reaching out from other communities, telling us that our fight had inspired them to take action against corrupt HOAs in their own areas. It felt like we had ignited a movement, and Karen, for all her bluster and bravado, had become the poster child for everything that could go wrong when power was concentrated in the hands of one tyrant. As the weeks passed, the atmosphere in the neighborhood changed dramatically. The sense of unease and fear that had hung over us like a storm cloud for years was gone. People were planting gardens again without worrying about the HOA giving them fines for unauthorized flowers. The kids played outside more without their parents constantly checking for letters in the mail warning them about petty infractions. We held a neighborhood barbecue to celebrate, with residents from all corners of the community coming together in solidarity. It felt like a rebirth of the spirit of the neighborhood. I didn't realize how much the tension had affected me until it was gone. I slept better, my anxiety was reduced, and I found myself looking out at my garden, my glorious tomato plants, feeling a sense of triumph. They were mine, and Karen would never take them from me again. The HOA, once this untouchable force in our lives, had been reduced to a cautionary tale. We had reclaimed our homes, our freedom, and our dignity, and while it hadn't been easy, it had been more than worth it. As for Karen, her life had spiraled. She had been publicly humiliated in the press and shunned by the neighbors. Without the power of the HOA behind her, she found herself isolated. Rumors circulated about her trying to form a new HOA in a different community, but I doubted anyone would be foolish enough to give her another chance. The last I heard, she was trying to sell her house, likely to move somewhere where her influence wasn't so easily challenged. It was a bittersweet ending for her. A woman who once thought she could control everything around her was now powerless, and in many ways she had only herself to blame. I often reflect on how much we all changed through this ordeal. What had started as a personal nightmare for me and a handful of neighbors turned into a full-scale revolt against an unjust system. We fought not just for our homes, but for the principle that we should have a say in the places where we live. We learned that standing together in the face of corruption could spark real change. And the best part, we did it without resorting to violence or hatred, but through unity, persistence, and a willingness to speak out against injustice. As I look out over my garden now, the tomatoes ripening under the warm sun, I realize that in the end, it wasn't just about the petty rules and fines. It was about taking back control of our lives and proving that even against the most oppressive systems, there's power in numbers and in a little bit of creative revenge. And as for my tomatoes, well, let's just say I'm never going to stop growing them. Not for Karen, not for anyone.